On February 14, 1929, 7 men were forced to line up against a cold brick wall in a Chicago garage and were ripped apart by a hail of Thompson's submachine gun fire, while the shooters wore police uniforms. The brutal tableau unfolded at the SMC Cartage Company garage on Clark Street, a place that would forever be etched into the city's dark folklore. For years, the nation believed the gang wars of Prohibition were confined to back alley brawls and speakeasy raids. This massacre shattered that illusion, exposing how organized crime could masquerade as law enforcement and strike with military precision. The event was not an isolated act of vengeance, but a flashpoint in a larger struggle for control over Chicago's illegal liquor empire, a struggle that would reshape the city's underworld forever. Yet what no one knew at the time, what investigators would only piece together decades later, was how the very tools of the state were turned against its own citizens, and why this single night would become the grim benchmark for all future gang violence. The victims that day belonged to the North Side Gang, a coalition forged in the early 1920s by Irish-American bootleggers who had carved out a lucrative market along Chicago's lakefront. Leaders like Bugs Moran and his enforcers, most notably brothers Peter and Frank Gusenberg, Albert Kashilek, Adam Heyer, John May, James Clark, and the suspected associate Harry Weber, had built an empire that rivaled Al Capone's South Side outfit. Their operations stretched from speakeasies to gambling dens, and their reputation for ruthless retaliation kept rivals at bay. By late 1928, however, the North Side was under relentless pressure. Capone's men had begun hijacking shipments, and a series of police raids, often tipped off by corrupt officials, had thinned their ranks. The Gusenberg brothers, especially Frank, were feared for their willingness to use violence without hesitation, making them prime targets in an escalating tit-for-tat war. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of both gangs' resolve. At precisely 9:30 p.m., a police cruiser rolled into the SMC garage, its flashing lights casting eerie shadows across rows of parked trucks. 4 men in crisp police uniforms stepped out, their badges conspicuously absent, a detail later confirmed by witnesses who swore they saw no insignia on the jackets. The gunman ordered the 7 North Side members to line up against the far wall, a command obeyed with trembling resignation. Then, without warning, the front doors of the cruiser burst open and the attackers unleashed over 200 rounds of .45 caliber ammunition from Thompson submachine guns. The deafening roar drowned out any pleas. Bodies fell like rag dolls, riddled with bullet holes that pierced flesh and bone alike. When the smoke cleared, 7 men lay dead on the concrete floor, their blood staining the garage's linoleum in a macabre tableau of organized murder. The gunmen fled the scene in 2 battered Ford Model T automobiles, vehicles later traced to Al Capone's South Side outfit through registration records and testimony from informants who had infiltrated the syndicate. Police recovered more than 200 spent .45 caliber cartridges, a forensic clue that matched the weaponry known to be favored by Capone's hit squads. Yet despite the overwhelming physical evidence, Capone publicly denied any involvement, insisting he was merely a businessman concerned with legitimate enterprises. The denial would become a hallmark of his public persona, but investigators pieced together a chain of connections. The Model Ts were owned by men who had previously supplied Capone's runners. The Thompson guns matched those used in earlier South Side hits, and several witnesses identified the uniforms as being sourced from a precinct known to collude with the outfit. The case file grew into a damning dossier that, while never securing a conviction, painted an unmistakable portrait of organized complicity. The massacre ignited a firestorm across the city's criminal landscape. Bugs Moran, enraged and grieving, vowed retaliation, setting off a series of bombings, drive-by shootings, and street battles that turned Chicago's streets into a battlefield. Capone's organization, emboldened by the successful elimination of key North Side figures, tightened its grip on liquor distribution, gambling houses, and protection rackets throughout the South Side. Yet the public outcry was equally fierce. Newspapers splashed graphic images of the carnage across front pages, and citizens demanded an end to the lawlessness that seemed to thrive under the guise of prohibition. The federal government responded by intensifying its crackdown on organized crime. culminating in the 1931 conviction of Capone for tax evasion, a legal strategy born from the inability to directly tie him to murders like the Valentine's Day Massacre. Even as the city reeled, several mysteries lingered. Who had ordered the hit? Was it a direct command from Capone himself, or did an ambitious lieutenant act independently to curry favor? Why were police uniforms chosen? Was it simply a tactical ploy to lower the victim's guard, or was there a deeper collaboration with corrupt officers who supplied the attire? Investigators later uncovered that several members of the Chicago Police Department had been on Capone's payroll, receiving regular kickbacks for turning a blind eye. Yet no definitive proof ever surfaced linking any specific officer to the garage raid. These unanswered questions would haunt historians and investigators alike, prompting endless speculation about the extent of institutional corruption that allowed such a massacre to unfold under the veneer of lawfulness. The events of that Valentine's Day reshaped public perception of organized crime in America. No longer were gangsters seen as shadowy figures operating solely in dimly lit backrooms. They were now recognized as a parallel power structure capable of mimicking state authority and executing mass killings with military efficiency. The massacre became a cautionary tale, cited in congressional hearings on organized crime and used by journalists to illustrate the perils of unchecked corruption. It also left an indelible mark on Chicago's cultural memory, a city that would forever associate February 14 not just with romance, but with one of the most infamous acts of violence in its history. The image of men forced against a wall, their lives extinguished by gunfire from those who pretended to protect them, continues to serve as a stark reminder of how quickly law can be subverted when power is concentrated in criminal hands. Decades have passed since the smoke cleared from the SMC garage, yet the reverberations of that night still echo through modern discussions about organized crime, police accountability, and the unintended consequences of prohibitionist policies. The massacre forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When legal frameworks become tools for profit rather than protection, society pays the ultimate price. Contemporary movements demanding transparency within law enforcement agencies draw an unbroken line back to the uniforms that once concealed murderers in 1929. As we reflect on the lives lost, Peter and Frank Gusenberg, Albert Koschelik, Adam Heyer, John May, James Clark, and Harry Weber, we are reminded that behind every statistic lies a human story cut short by greed and violence. Their deaths serve not only as a historical footnote, but as an enduring call to vigilance, urging each generation to safeguard the thin line between order and chaos before it is crossed again.